The tray slipped from Dorian Brooks' hands and exploded on the cafeteria floor, spaghetti sauce splattering up his jeans like fresh wounds. For one sharp second, the whole room froze. Then came the laughter, loud, merciless, rising in a wave that crashed against the polished walls of Wellington Academy. It stung more than the food clinging to his sneakers. It hollowed out the air. Chase Whitmore stood nearby, perfect and untouchable, laughing louder than anyone else. Around him, his friends, polished, rich, clean, hooted and jeered, proud of the scene they'd orchestrated. Dorian knelt slowly, gathering the broken plastic fork, the splintered tray. His fingers worked methodically, even as heat boiled behind his eyes, even as shame clawed at his throat. Every second felt like a lifetime stretched under a microscope. Chase sauntered closer, voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Some people just don't know how to handle themselves," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The cafeteria roared again. Dorian didn't look up, didn't respond. His silence wasn't weakness. It was armor. It was the only shield he had left in a school where he stood alone, the only dark-skinned face in a sea of polished white privilege. When he finally stood, he glanced once at Chase, and in that brief glance, saw it, the flicker, a crack in the perfect facade. Fear? No, not yet. But something unsettled, something human. Dorian turned and walked away, tray pieces gripped tight in his hand. Outside, the late autumn wind bit into his skin as he slipped behind the main building, dropping the broken tray into the nearest dumpster. He leaned back against the brick wall, breath steaming in the cold air. You could walk away, a voice inside whispered. You could stop fighting them. Stop fighting everything. But he thought of his mother's tired eyes lighting up when they toured the school. Thought of his father's strong, silent pride. Thought of every night he told himself this would be worth it, that someday, the struggle would mean something. Dorian clenched his fists until his knuckles ached. He would not give Chase Whitmore the satisfaction. He would not be the stain they wanted him to be. He was here. He was staying. And he would endure, because sometimes endurance was its own kind of war. The day dragged on, thick and slow, like walking through mud. Dorian drifted from class to class, invisible and yet hyper-visible at once, the boy who didn't belong but could not be ignored. He had learned early that silence was safer, learned that speaking too much, laughing too loud, even standing too tall could make him a target. Not because he was wrong, but because he refused to fit the mold that Wellington tried to press onto everyone. When the final bell rang, Dorian didn't rush for the buses like the others. He moved through the emptying hallways, his sneakers squeaking against the glossy floors still sticky from the day's disasters. The art room waited at the end of the corridor, a small, messy place filled with the sharp smell of paint and turpentine, where no one cared if you didn't smile or speak. Here, Dorian could breathe. He slipped inside, dropped his bag under a stool, and pulled out his battered sketchbook. The pencil moved almost on its own, fast and furious, scarring the paper with jagged lines. He drew a boy standing alone in a field of mirrors. Every reflection twisted, distorted, making him monstrous. And overhead, dark clouds gathered, heavy and low. He didn't need to wonder who the boy was. He knew. Art was the only place where Dorian could pour the things he couldn't say. The anger, the loneliness, the exhaustion of being too much and never enough at the same time. A soft sound broke the silence. Miss Caldwell, the art teacher, peeked in, saw him hunched over his sketchbook, and gave a small nod before disappearing again. No questions. No pity. Just space. It was more kindness than most dared to show. When the sun dipped behind the hills and shadows stretched long across the school grounds, Dorian finally packed up. As he walked to the bus stop, the cold gnawed through his hoodie. His sneakers, still stained faintly from the spaghetti, left dull marks on the sidewalk. The sleek black cars lined the pickup lane, BMWs, Range Rovers, Teslas gleaming under the dying light. Dorian's ride, an old, wheezing bus, sputtered into view, coughing smoke into the sharp evening air. He climbed aboard, slid into the farthest seat, and pressed his forehead against the icy window. Outside, he caught a glimpse of Chase laughing with his friends by a silver sports car, tossing his perfect hair out of his eyes, the world unfolding effortlessly at his feet. For a brief, poisonous second, Dorian wished he could hate him purely. But what he felt was worse, an aching hollowness, a gnawing hunger for something he couldn't even name. The bus jolted forward, rattling past the manicured lawns and glittering houses, past the lives Dorian would never be invited into. He closed his eyes. Today had left bruises. Tomorrow would leave more. But he would not vanish. Not yet. Snow clung thinly to the edges of the sidewalks, staining the morning light with a soft grayness. Wellington Academy looked even colder under the frost, an endless stretch of glass and stone that reflected nothing but its own emptiness. Inside, the tension built like pressure in a sealed jar. It was history presentation day, and Dorian had spent the last 3 nights stitching together a project he knew would carry the weight of everyone else's laziness. Of course, he had been left with the bulk of the work. Of course, no one questioned it. He stood now at the front of the classroom, the laptop humming beside him, the projector flickering to life. Faces stared back at him, some bored, some amused, a few openly hostile. Among them, in the back row, lounged Chase Whitmore, spinning a pen between his fingers like a lazy predator watching its prey. Dorian inhaled slowly and began. The words flowed smoothly at first, clear, confident, rehearsed until they felt like armor. He spoke of history, of injustice, of the long arc bending toward some imagined justice. But halfway through, the screen behind him sputtered. Instead of slides about civil rights leaders, a crude, photoshopped image appeared, Dorian's face distorted grotesquely, his skin color exaggerated to monstrous proportions. The laughter that broke out was shrill, ugly. Dorian froze. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He turned slightly, catching sight of Chase smirking in the back, phone half hidden under the desk. The teacher, Mr. Harris, stood by the podium, mouth half open, paralyzed between action and cowardice. The room waited. They want a reaction, Dorian realized. They want you to explode, to validate everything they whisper about you behind your back. His hands trembled. Then, with careful precision, he unplugged the projector, cutting the screen to black. Silence. He picked up a piece of chalk, turned to the blackboard, and continued the presentation, sketching timelines and names in clean, steady strokes, speaking louder now, clearer. He didn't stop. He didn't stumble. The laughter died away, replaced by an uneasy, fidgeting quiet. When he finished, Dorian set the chalk down and turned to the class, his voice low but razor-sharp. This history doesn't disappear because you laugh at it. Or at me. No one moved. No one spoke. Dorian gathered his things and walked out without waiting for permission. The hallway outside swallowed him, cool and echoing. His pulse thundered in his ears, and his chest ached with the effort of holding himself together. But under the exhaustion, a thin, fierce thread burned inside him. Pride. He had not broken. He had not given them the show they craved. Somewhere behind him, he knew, Chase was watching. And for the first time, Dorian wondered if maybe it wasn't him who was losing ground. Maybe Chase felt it too, the cracks beginning to form, spidering outwards. Days blurred into one another, cold, gray, brittle. But something had changed in the air between Dorian and Chase. There were no more tray spills or whispered slurs. Instead, there was a new war, one of stares that lingered too long, of shoulders that brushed a little too hard in the hallway, of silence so thick it roared louder than laughter ever had. Dorian could feel the weight of it in every step he took through Wellington's immaculate halls. He carried himself straighter now, jaw clenched, gaze fixed forward. If they were trying to push him back into invisibility, they were failing. But every step cost him something. He spent nights lying awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of his bedroom, fists curled into the blanket. Rage boiled just beneath his skin, a constant, thrumming thing. It was exhausting to carry so much of yourself unspoken. The breaking point came during an assembly. The entire student body packed into the auditorium, restless and murmuring, as the principal droned on about community and respect. Empty words that clattered off the high walls and fell flat. When the awards began, Dorian barely listened until he heard his name. Outstanding academic excellence, Dorian Brooks. A ripple of awkward claps filled the room. Some polite, some begrudging, most indifferent. Dorian stood, his shoulders squared, and made his way to the stage. He felt the eyes on him, every step a trial. The certificate felt thin and cheap in his hand. And then from the back row, the slow, mocking clap. Chase. It echoed in the stillness, a deliberate insult wrapped in false applause. Dorian's chest tightened. His fingers dug into the edge of the certificate so hard it crumpled. Laughter rippled faintly among the students. Mr. Harris shifted uncomfortably on stage but said nothing. Dorian turned toward the crowd, and for a moment, the room sharpened into brutal focus. Every smirk, every averted gaze, every teacher's silence. He moved down the aisle, pulse pounding in his ears, heading straight for Chase's row. The laughter faltered. Chase leaned back lazily, waiting, daring. One punch, one word. That was all it would take to shatter everything. One slip, and they would paint him forever, not as the boy who fought back, but as the angry problem they always wanted him to be. Dorian stopped just short of Chase's seat. Their eyes locked, Dorian's burning with fury he barely held back, Chase's glittering with cruel expectation. The world balanced on a knife's edge. Then Dorian smiled. Not a soft smile. Not a forgiving one. A sharp, cutting smile that said, "You don't own me. You never did." He turned, certificate crushed in his hand, and walked away. The auditorium buzzed faintly behind him, confusion and discomfort swirling like dust. Dorian didn't look back. Didn't need to. He had won something far more important than their approval. He had won himself. The Whitmore house sat at the end of the street like a fortress, towering walls, spotless lawns, windows that gleamed like teeth. Inside, Chase Whitmore dropped his backpack onto the polished floor and stood for a moment, staring at nothing. The silence pressed against him. No shouting, no greetings, just the faint hum of distant heating vents, the ticking of an invisible clock. He climbed the staircase slowly, each step heavier than the last, and pushed open the door to his bedroom. The walls were lined with trophies, plaques, awards, all relics of a boy sculpted into someone else's idea of success. Chase pulled off his blazer and tossed it onto the bed. His hands shook, barely, but enough for him to notice. He hated it. Hated that a single look from Dorian Brooks, a single refusal, had carved so deep under his skin. He sat at his desk, flipping open his laptop, needing the familiar numbness of scrolling through social feeds. The smiling faces, the staged lives. But tonight, it all looked different. Thin, empty. He clicked past pictures of parties he didn't remember attending, of girls he barely knew draped over his arm, of friends locked in fake laughter. And somewhere beneath the anger, beneath the arrogance he wore like armor, a hollow ache gnawed at him. When had everything started feeling so fake? Chase leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. He remembered being a kid, running through the woods behind their house, laughing without worrying who was watching. Before his father taught him about winning, about image, about control. You're either above or you're beneath, his father had said, voice hard and final. There is no middle ground, Chase. Remember that. And Chase had remembered, had built himself into a fortress of smiles and cruelty, had learned to crush anything that didn't fit into the polished world he was promised. Until Dorian, until a boy who wasn't supposed to matter refused to fall apart, refused to let Chase's world define him. The shame crept up Chase's throat, hot and unfamiliar. He slammed the laptop shut and sat in the dark, heart pounding. He didn't know what terrified him more, the thought that Dorian saw through him, or the gnawing possibility that maybe everything Dorian represented was something Chase had lost a long time ago. The open battles ended. No more trays flying. No more staged humiliations. Wellington Academy returned to its cold routines, but beneath the surface, the war had simply changed shape. It was quieter now, sharper. Dorian walked the halls like a shadow stitched into the fabric of the school, not invisible, no, but unacknowledged. Students glanced at him, then looked away too quickly, as if afraid that meeting his eyes might brand them, might make them see too much. The silence was deliberate, a new form of exclusion, crueler in its effort to pretend he wasn't even there. Dorian felt it in the pauses that fell when he entered a room, in the empty seats that bloomed around him like bruises in the cafeteria. The laughter still came, but softer now, behind cupped hands and downturned gazes. Chase no longer mocked him openly. Instead, he watched. From across classrooms, from the edges of locker banks, from his seat at the back of assemblies, Chase's eyes followed Dorian with a weight that felt heavier than words. It wasn't the look of a predator anymore. It was something more complicated, something Dorian wasn't sure how to name. He poured himself into his work, into art. After school, he stayed late in the art room, sketching feverishly, the pencil scratching against paper like a heartbeat. Faces stared back at him from the pages, proud, defiant, wounded, unbowed. It was here that he rebuilt himself every day, layering resilience over the fractures Chase and Wellington had tried to carve into him. Miss Caldwell let him stay as long as he wanted, sometimes offering a quiet nod before locking up the building. He would leave in the deep blue of early evening, the cold gnawing through his jacket, the sky above vast and bruised. One Thursday, as he packed up his things, Dorian caught sight of Chase standing by the hallway windows. Not laughing, not surrounded by his entourage. Just standing there, hands buried deep in his pockets, looking out at the skeletal trees shaking in the wind. Their eyes met across the empty corridor. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them looked away. Chase gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a brittle acknowledgement, a white flag too fragile to survive a breeze. Dorian didn't nod back. He didn't move. He simply slung his backpack over his shoulder and walked past without a word. But something lingered in the space between them, a tension different from hatred, different from fear. Something raw, something new. Dorian didn't know yet if it was the beginning of a bridge or another trap. He only knew that whatever war they were fighting, it was no longer about winning. It was about surviving with something human still intact. It happened after school, when the corridors of Wellington were nearly empty, and the light from the windows spilled long, golden trails across the floors. Dorian was at his locker, packing his books slowly, methodically, when he heard the footsteps behind him, steady, deliberate. He turned. Chase stood there, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, mouth set in a grim line. No entourage, no smirk, just the two of them, alone in the fading light. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them buzzed, stretched thin by months of silent wars, bruised pride, and things too long unsaid. Then Chase spoke, voice low and rough. "Why didn't you hit me?" The question dropped into the space between them like a stone into still water. Dorian blinked slowly, studying him. Chase shifted, his jaw tightening. He wasn't mocking. He wasn't daring Dorian to snap. He was asking. He was searching. Dorian shut his locker door with a soft click and leaned back against it, arms crossed. "Because I'm not like you," he said simply. The words weren't meant to wound. They were just true. Chase flinched anyway, like the truth had landed harder than a fist. "I thought." Chase's voice faltered, then hardened. "You think you're better?" Dorian's stare didn't waver. "No," he said. "I think I'm trying not to be worse." The hall seemed to shrink around them, the weight of the moment pressing hard against their ribs. Chase exhaled sharply, scrubbing a hand through his hair. "You don't know what it's like," he muttered, anger and shame tangled in his voice. "Always having to be something perfect, something brutal." Dorian's lips twisted into something almost like a smile, but not quite. "You're right," he said quietly. "I don't know what it's like to have everything and still feel like it's not enough." Chase's head snapped up, eyes blazing. But the anger sputtered out almost as quickly as it came. There was nothing left to defend. There was no winner here. Only two boys standing in the wreckage of who they were supposed to be. Chase stared at the floor, then back at Dorian, the words clawing their way out. "I was wrong." The hallway caught the confession and held it there, raw and shivering. Dorian nodded once, not in forgiveness, not yet, but in acknowledgement. Because in this place, in this world, even admitting you were wrong was a battle. And Chase had just taken his first real step. Without another word, Dorian slung his backpack over his shoulder and walked away, boots echoing in the empty hall. But this time, as he left, he didn't feel Chase's hatred trailing behind him. He felt something else, something heavy, something human. And for the first time, Dorian allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, some wars didn't have to end in ruin. Some could end in something new. The days grew colder. Frost clung stubbornly to the edges of the sidewalks, and the trees stripped themselves bare under the pale, hard sky. Inside Wellington Academy, life moved on. Assemblies, exams, the endless, careful dance of appearances. But something between Dorian and Chase had shifted so subtly that at first no one noticed. It wasn't friendship. Not yet. It was something smaller, more fragile, an absence of cruelty, a space where something better might grow. It began with a silent nod in the hallway, a door held open without a word. A textbook passed across a desk when Dorian forgot his. Tiny moments, easy to miss, but real in a way that even the grandest speeches weren't. One afternoon, as Dorian was packing up after art club, Chase hovered awkwardly near the door, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. Dorian pretended not to notice, giving him the choice to stay or leave. Finally, Chase stepped forward, holding something out. A crumpled brown paper bag. Dorian raised an eyebrow. Chase shrugged, not meeting his eyes. "It's just lunch," he muttered. "Didn't know if you had anything." For a second, Dorian stared at the offering, simple, clumsy, raw, more real than any apology. He took the bag without speaking. Chase nodded once, almost shyly, and turned to go. At the door, he hesitated. "You ever?" He began, then stopped, clearing his throat. "You ever want to hang out or something? I mean, whatever." It was a mess of words, but Dorian heard what was buried underneath. An offering. A chance. He didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. The silence stretched between them, not heavy this time, but waiting. Finally, Dorian nodded. A small thing. Enough. Chase smiled. A real, unsure smile, and disappeared down the hall. Dorian sat back on the bench, the paper bag warm in his hands. He knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be mistakes, misunderstandings, old habits dying hard. But for the first time since he stepped into Wellington's polished, brittle world, Dorian felt something unfamiliar stirring inside him. Not survival, not endurance. Hope. Tiny, fragile, impossible, and burning steady as a star against the long, cold dark.